Let's jump right into this explainer because today we're shifting our focus completely away from the physical weapons of war. We're going to map out a hidden, entirely invisible battlefield, the human mind. When we think of military history, we usually just picture tanks rolling in, heavy artillery, and these grand sweeping strategic maneuvers. But what we're looking at today are the silent psychological forces that actually dictate whether those grand maneuvers succeed or completely fall apart.
It really brings up the ultimate riddle of conflict, doesn't it? What actually keeps a force fighting? You can have the absolute most advanced weapons and the best equipped soldiers on the planet, but all of that cutting-edge equipment, it's literally useless without the human mind there to operate it. Think about it. When the freezing wind is howling around you and artillery is raining down, what is it that actually keeps a force holding the line?
So to figure that out, we've got a pretty packed agenda. We're going to break down the invisible math of the combat power equation, look at the absolute foundation of leadership, and then dive into the crushing elements of battle stress. After that, we'll analyze the insidious tactics of psychological warfare, look at how armies actually build psychological resistance, and finally, we're going to put all of this to the ultimate test by looking at the harrowing 1962 Sino-Indian conflict. Let's get into it. Section 1. The combat power equation. Let's look at this invisible math.
Okay, so the absolute bedrock of military theory really comes down to this simple but honestly profound equation. Combat power isn't just about firepower. It is weapons plus training plus leadership plus morale. Now, the first two there, the weapons and the training, those are highly visible, right? You can physically count rifles, you can measure marching drills, but leadership and morale, those are your invisible multipliers. And the crazy thing is, if leadership and morale drop to zero, the entire equation zeroes out. The whole shebang. It doesn't matter how big your arsenal is. Section 2. The foundation of leadership. This is the human glue for that equation.
Because look, leadership in combat is absolutely not about sitting in some comfortable rear echelon office issuing orders. Not at all. A true leader has to actively gain and then aggressively maintain the respect and confidence of their troops no matter how bad things get. It's this incredibly delicate mix of setting a personal example, persuasion, and honestly, sometimes compulsion. Now, what's fascinating is that historical analyses of the 1962 conflict point out that while junior officers on the ground generally performed really well and handled their commands, the major shortcomings happened at the higher levels. A lot of higher commanders simply didn't rely enough on the initiative of those lower commanders. And at the end of the day, the ultimate test of leadership isn't what looks brilliant on paper, it's what your troops can actually pull off when they are pushed to the absolute brink. Now, what's really interesting about the source material here is the stark contrast it draws between tactical learning and strategic failure. It's like militaries are usually pretty good at learning the micro lessons, like figuring out how to collect and analyze tactical intelligence right there in the dirt. But those macro lessons, those are way harder to grasp. Historically, analyses show that national security policy at the very highest levels has just too often been based on hunches, electoral needs, and populism, rather than a cold, hard threat assessment. But true national security really demands expert input completely separated from partisan politicking. Relying on political whims instead of a proper, rigorous analysis of the variables, that is a dangerously slow problem to fix, and it leaves a nation incredibly vulnerable.
Moving to Section 3, Elements of Battle Stress. This is where leadership meets its most extreme test.
I want you to picture this. Imagine standing at an altitude of 14,000 to 16,000 feet on the Ladakh border. At that point, you aren't just fighting an enemy, you are literally at war with the environment. The freezing cold just entirely saps your energy. The intense isolation starts playing tricks on your mind. And then, paralyzing fear and severe fatigue begin eating away at your willpower. This right here is the overwhelming physiological and psychological onslaught of battle stress. It is basically the perfect breeding ground for doubt.
Section 4. Tactics of psychological warfare.
So right into this environment of extreme, crushing vulnerability, an adversary is going to deploy their absolute most insidious weapon, psychological warfare. This is the deliberate use of sneaky, underhanded techniques to actually defeat an enemy before the main shooting even kicks off. It is quite literally an attack on the mind. The goal is super simple: inject confusion, spread propaganda, and shatter the enemy's belief in their cause, their leaders, and honestly, their own survival. Because if you can break their will to fight, you don't even have to physically destroy the army. They've already lost.
And during the 1962 conflict, we saw this applied incredibly practically and just ruthlessly. Chinese forces relied heavily on loudspeaker propaganda deployed right up at the forward defense lines. So put yourself in those boots. You're an isolated soldier in the freezing, pitch-black dark, and suddenly booming out across the mountains you hear voices speaking in your own native language, telling you to give up.
These broadcasts were specifically engineered to confuse the troops and directly gut their morale. It is an incredibly unsettling, highly calculated psychological strike.
Section 5. Building psychological resistance. So how do you actually fight back against that?
Well, how does a military fortify the minds of its soldiers against these kinds of invisible attacks? It all comes down to combat psychology. To manage to sail through the absolute chaos and confusion of battle, a unit has to be psychologically attuned. So how do they actually pull that off? First, they train by living hard together. Men have to be prepped to endure sustained shelling. Second, and this is absolutely vital, officers have to live right alongside their men, completely stripped of any special privileges. Sharing those exact same miserable hardships is what fuses them into a cohesive, unbreakable unit. And finally, you have mental preparation. Through lectures and open discussions, troops are actively taught to anticipate this kind of insidious propaganda. The idea is, if they expect the treachery, they won't just ignore it. Their belief in the righteousness of their fight actually gets stronger just by listening to the enemy's desperate tricks.
Section 6. The Ultimate Test, 1962. Let's look at how this all played out in reality.
And this brilliantly illustrates the catastrophic impact of ignoring those strategic macro lessons we talked about earlier. In 1962, you had Indian troops equipped with literal World War I era .303 rifles. They're fighting in cotton uniforms, in freezing mountain winds, relying on airdrops that had a staggering 70% failure rate, just 30% success. And against them, Chinese forces fully equipped with automatic weapons, proper winter gear, trucks, and pre-built ammunition dumps. The source material attributes a huge chunk of this disparity to Prime Minister Nehru's non-alignment policy and his strict adherence to ahimsa, which basically choked off the import of modern arms. As you can imagine, this massive physical disadvantage took a severe toll on Indian troop morale.
Yet despite being vastly outgunned and supplied by air in these tiny penny packets, that invisible combat power we keep talking about was put to the ultimate test. Just look at the numbers for a second. At Garung Hill, just 17 Indian defenders stood against a massive artillery-backed attack. At Razang La, a single company of about 100 men faced the exact same nightmare. They had no artillery support, they lacked modern weapons, but they held the line.
Let's walk through November 18th. Right at the crack of dawn, the massive artillery bombardment kicked off. Those 17 men at Garung Hill, they actually halted the initial attacks, but eventually they died to the man. There was absolutely no retreat. Over at Rezangla, the company fought continuously from dawn until nearly midnight. And this incredible, stubborn resistance wasn't for nothing. It bought absolutely crucial time, which enabled Brigadier Tian Raina to successfully redeploy his forces to positions in Chushul, positions that they held right up until the ceasefire.
14. Just 14. Out of the 112 Indian defenders at Rezang La, only 14 men survived. They fought and died like no other. I mean, think about it. Despite the massive macro policy failures, the completely obsolete weapons, the cotton uniforms in the freezing cold, and that relentless psychological warfare booming over the loudspeakers, their invisible combat power, their leadership and their morale, it held firm. Against impossible odds, they inflicted heavy casualties on an overwhelmingly superior physical force.
Because the true battle is always fought twice, right? First inside the mind and then out on the ground. Psychological warfare, battle stress, leadership, morale. These are the hidden, invisible forces that literally dictate the destiny of nations. You can lack the right equipment, you can be completely betrayed by policy, but if your will remains unbroken, you can stand against a mountain. So we'll leave you with this final powerful thought from the source material. Before breaking a force physically, an opponent tries to break its will. The next time you see a geopolitical conflict unfolding on the news, ask yourself, who is actually winning the battle inside the mind?